首先做一下自我介绍我是张江首先呢，我有几个身份我是来自咱们学校，就北京师范大学系统科学学院是这里面的老师。那么另外呢，就是我们也是今天的这个活动的主办方之一极致俱乐部创始人那么另外还有一个身份是那个腾讯研究院的这个特聘顾问有这么几个身份。然后另外还有最重要的一个身份，就是我是这个Professor West 的一个合作者就是大家如果看那本书的话，里面有我的名字很荣幸这个我跟他一直在合作有关这个公司这方面的这个规模法则这方面的这种研究工作。那么我们今天这个活动呢，实际上大家看到是有多个主办方那么我念一下包括这个极致俱乐部包括腾讯研究院，包括中信出版社，还有这个北京师范大学系统科学学院这个4个主办方。那么我们这个呢，实际上也是一个系列活动。这个系列活动就是我们极致俱乐部和腾讯研究院合作的这个 AI and Society， 就是人工智能与社会这样一个系列活动。这是第11期是吧？好像是第11期，对对对然后呢接下来呢，就是我从这个一个合作者的身份来介绍一下这个West 教授那他呢也是一个非常具有这种传奇性的这种人物首先呢，就是他50岁以前嘛，大概是一直都是一个纯粹的理论物理学家非常纯，是那种 particle physics 做这种粒子物理的。然后呢很有意思的是50多岁时候他进行了一个人生的一个转折。为什么呢？那时候他在思考一个非常有意思的问题，就是为什么生命都会死亡。那么这样一个问题呢，就带着他去看一些有关生物学方面的文献。那看完了以后他就很不满意，因为所有关生物学的文献几乎很少有讨论为什么会死亡，特别是定量化的去讨论为什么会死亡这样一件事情所以他就很不满意，然后就开始寻找更多的合作。那么一个偶然的机会也是使得让他呢认识到了这个来自墨西哥州大学的一个搞生态理论的这样一个生物学家。然后呢他们就针对所谓的克莱伯定律待会儿这个 West 也会有介绍来进行这方面的研究和突破。因为这个东西呢是定量化的去研究生命它的新陈代谢，它的心跳以及它的这个 lifespan 也就是寿命的大小有一个系统的理论。那么一下子呢他就进入了生物学这样一个领域有一个华丽的转身。也是从那个时候开始这个就是 West 他们提出了一个 WBE 模型，并且在 Science and Nature 大概有10几篇论文给出来可以说找到了一整套刻画生物学的精确的数学理论和数学框架这个有很像当年这个第谷和开普勒那个时代大家知道第谷是收集大量数据，然后开普勒根据这些数据给出了行星运动方程。那么现在我们就是从生物学的实证数据出发，给出了一整套定量的这样的一个理论那么在这样一个理论框架下又经过了大概不到10年吧左右的发展。当所有人都认为West 教授就会沿着生物学家的道路一直前进下去的时候老爷子突然又转行了他是经常性的转行研究什么呢？研究程式科学。对所以看起来很不相干的领域，对吧？你看粒子物理，然后生物学，然后程式科学又转为研究程式。而之所以他可以这样去做道理很简单，就是因为规模法则这一套它背后的那个数学规律是一致的非常的相似因此当他把这个理论用到程式上的时候那么他就得出了一系列的这种结论包括跟他的一些合作者进行合作。那这些结论呢都会对我们这个城市规划都很有帮助。然后又过了大概也就5、6年的时间那个时候呢我也是非常有幸来到了这个圣塔菲研究所访问他们这个组结果呢那个时候 West 又转行了，但这回转的并不是那么大而是开始去研究公司科学我们看到这些领域其实都是传统是属于社会科学或管理科学方面但是呢也是同样的这一套框架能够去 transfer 过去 所以这就是我们所说的这种跨学科的这个魅力所在哈。看起来八竿子打不着的不同领域，居然能够找到它背后的统一性的这种规律。那么现在当然这个故事还在继续哈，实际上还没有书写完。包括呢，就是在Scale 规模这本书里面，我们也知道，就是它这个关于公司这部分介绍也是仅仅开了一个小头，相对于生物和城市科学的这种介绍，相对来说少的很多所以这个故事还在继续。那么也非常希望呢，这个在座的听众，包括有很多同学能够进入我们所谓的跨学科领域的这种研究那么 West 呢，当然他也有很多的不同的身份包括呢他以前曾经是这个圣塔菲研究所，这个呢也是我们复杂性科学、系统科学一个标杆性的一个单位它是这种跨学科研究的圣地哈。他曾经是这个圣塔菲研究所的这个所长，后来呢，当然是长期是在这个研究所评为这个所谓的这个 distinguished professor。杰出教授很可惜，就是诺贝尔奖从来没有设一个跨学科诺贝尔奖那么如果有的话，我们相信那这个奖项一定是属于 Geoffrey West 教授的。对，那不知道现在准备怎么样 ？OK。
Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Who can speak English? So I'm sorry I have to give the talk in English. I don't know Chinese, and you'll have to hopefully be able to understand. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Jake, for inviting me. The title is, of course, a grandiose, big title, and it allows me to talk about many things. And just to start the discussion, I have this picture, which it looks like, actually, you don't bother to turn the lights off. There is actually a picture there. And you don't have to see it. There is something there. And what it is my estimate of what a picture taken from a satellite in 1940, which is the year I was born, you can see, what the Earth would look like at night. Okay, the night lights of Earth in 1940, the year I was born. And here's what it looks like now. So in this short period of time, the Earth is sort of lit up extraordinarily. And of course, you understand where this is, what's happened here. This is a reflection of the extraordinary urbanization that has occurred on the planet in that short period of time, and is again a manifestation of the faster than exponential growth of the population on the planet. But here we see it as represented by urbanization. And just to put that in perspective, that exponential or faster than exponential increase in urbanization is represented by these numbers. And I give you the United States numbers, but it would be even more so, I think, in China. That is that 200 years ago, only a few percent of the population was urban. And today, in the United States, 82% are urban. The planet as a whole crossed the halfway mark just a few years ago and is headed towards this 80% level. China, by the way, I'll show you some statistics you know better than I. China only recently crossed the halfway mark because it was relatively slow to urbanize. So this is equivalent to urbanizing now, between now and 2050, if you just do an averaging, of about 1.5 million people every week are being urbanized. And that's equivalent to adding a city of the size of Los Angeles about every couple of months, or New York every couple of months. A city of San Francisco just every few days, and a country the size of Denmark every week. Beijing about every 10 weeks is the equivalent of Beijing being on this planet, which is extraordinary. So the effect on everything that you can think of in terms of energy, resources, water, the social fabric is fantastic. And so one of the big questions is, to what extent is that sustainable, and what is the planet going to look like in the future? And at the very end, we'll come back to that. So here's the China situation. You can't see it under here, but the yellow is the rural population, and the dark is the urban population. And you can see the halfway mark, 50%, was just reached in the last few years. And China, of course, is very rapidly heading towards this 70-80% urbanization in the next few years, and is building cities at a rapid rate. And that's just China, but you also have, of course, India, Latin America, and Africa also trying to catch up and to urbanize. So, and that is, as I say, reflective of the extraordinary growth in the world population from when we first stopped being hunter-gatherers and became urban, or rather became social creatures. And now, there was this slow rise, and then beginning a couple of hundred years ago with the discovery of fossil fuels and the extraordinary discovery of entrepreneurship and capitalism, those combined led to this extraordinary increase in population. And that has been going on so that now we're over the 7 billion mark, and we're headed towards 10 or 12 billion on the planet in the next 50 years. So doesn't matter what political or economic system we seem to be in, the paradigm that we have set on the planet is the idea of open-ended growth. And here I just give you an example of the United States. This is from the middle of the 19th century, so this is over 150 years ago, to today. This is the GDP, and it's just continued to rise exponentially. It's kind of an extraordinary phenomenon, and that is now being reflected across the whole world. So given that role of urbanization, then it's clear that whatever the fate of the planet is long term, it's completely integrated with the fate of our cities. And so one of the themes that's going to go through this talk is the idea that cities and what happens in cities determines your lives and the lives of everybody else that's going to live on this planet in the coming years. So we all know what cities look like. You live in one of the biggest in the world, but they come in many shapes and sizes. And you know what attracts people to cities. Cities are attractive because they provide access to greater material wealth. They provide greater job opportunities. They provide access to culture of various kinds, to more restaurants, to more busier, buzzier kind of life, access to more people, access to more education, and so forth. Can everybody see these? It's transmitting strangely, but is it obvious? So all of this, again, no matter what the economy is or what the political system is, only can happen if you have a continuous supply of energy. So every thought, every manufacturing object, anything around you, of course, needs energy. You cannot sustain anything at a fundamental level without energy. So energy is absolutely crucial. And the most fundamental law of physics, the one that transcends all laws, is the second law of thermodynamics, which says that if you use energy to create order, creating order meaning that I create a city, I create a company, I create a cell, I create an organism, I create an iPhone, I create an automobile, whatever it is that I create by taking material and making order out of it, ordering it, somewhere I create disorder. So that's a fundamental law. That means that whenever I transform energy, I necessarily create useless energy. And that useless energy is called entropy. And so in doing this phenomenon, making this phenomenon of creating great social order by creating cities and all the socioeconomic phenomena around us, we necessarily create socioeconomic disorder, socioeconomic entropy, and that of course occurs in situations like this. These are examples of it, things like this and this. I needn't have shown you, you could just look outside. This is one of the inevitabilities, I'm afraid, of creating great order, and the big question is how do you minimize that? So all of these things are considered socioeconomic entropy. Even social disruption, the social fabric tearing. And the question is, are our cities going to end up looking like this, which cities on the planet do look like this, some of them, but is that what Beijing will look like in some way? Or is that what London will look like in 50 years? This is the question I think we have to face. So when you think of cities, you usually think of, and in fact the pictures I just showed, of the physicality of the cities. You think of the infrastructure, you think of the buildings and the roads, etc. But of course, that's only part of a city. But in fact, what is much more important to a city, obviously, is what cities are for. That is, they're for people, they're for us. And cities can be thought of as this extraordinary engine or extraordinary machine that we have invented in order to facilitate social interaction, to create ideas, to innovate, create wealth, and improve the quality and standard of living. That's what we have done by creating cities. And they're symbolically represented here. You can't see this very well because of the translation, but there's part of a city that's been there for 2,000 years. And I don't think you can see very well, but here there are people that are interacting, they're talking. Maybe I have another picture here. Oh, another one. This is actually a picture of New York from about 120 years ago, and you can see those buildings are still there, but you can see people interacting on the stage of which those buildings represent. And even though those buildings are still there, all those people have gone, new people have come, but the infrastructure is there to facilitate that interaction and create a kind of crucible reactor in order to get new things happening and create wealth. So this is the very nature of a city. It is the integration of, on the one hand, physical infrastructure, and on the other hand, the information being exchanged between people. And that's what I've said here. I don't know if you can read that. So on the one hand, the energy and resources, the physicality of the city, the metabolism of the city, and on the other hand, the social networks that provide information exchange, leading, as I've already mentioned, to innovative ideas and ultimately wealth production, and ultimately improvement of quality and standard of life. So on the one hand, cities and urbanization on the planet can be thought of as the problem, in the sense that many of the issues that we're facing, one of which I just showed you, the pollution that you have to live with, but the pollution around the globe, but the environmental issues, the question of the stability of markets, questions of risk, questions of health, questions of energy, is the availability of energy and resources, all of these huge problems that we're facing now and will face even more so in the future. They're all generated by cities, primarily because that's where the vast majority of people live. On the other hand, they're also the solution, because cities are a magnet that sucks people in, and that is the place where all the new ideas and all the wealth is produced. So the problems are created by cities, but the solution is also in the cities. And in that sense, if we're to think about the future of the planet, we need to ask ourselves, is it conceivable to have a serious science of cities that involves many of these kinds of concepts, but a science of cities, meaning by science of cities something that is quantitative, something that maybe can be put into mathematics, and certainly be computable, and be predictive, and be tested, but importantly to be predictive so that we can understand the mechanisms by which a city works and which all these problems occur, and also to be able to therefore mitigate the unintended consequences that come from the production of social entropy. So if you think about a science of cities, it's an extremely challenging and daunting phenomenon to be even contemplated, because thinking about cities, as it would be about economies in general, involves almost everything. And I've just written down a list here, put in boxes, of the various things that one has to be thinking about if one wants to develop a serious science of cities. I put them in boxes to symbolize the fact that the way we deal with problems is usually by putting boxes around them and focusing on that particular problem and forgetting about all the other things that are related to it. And in fact, each one of these, inside that box, you could put a box around, and inside that box you could put other boxes. And the way that we have traditionally dealt with those issues is to deconstruct them and think of each problem as if it is its own self-contained problem to be solved without recognition that all the other problems are related to it. So one of the things to recognize is, first of all, that all of these problems are interrelated. Secondly, that each one of these is highly complex and is continually evolving and adapting. So each one of these is a complex adaptive system, and the entire thing is a complex adaptive system made up of multiple complex adaptive systems. So, the idea that one could create a science of that is extremely daunting and challenging. So that's what I've said here. So if you don't do that, you run into the following problem. And this is just a little cartoon to illustrate it. So I don't know if you can read that. Can't wait for the road to be widened. In fact, we just spent, I don't know how long, in a situation just like this. That's why we're late, basically. Just like this. So this is the solution, of course. Finally, we have the solution because we put in a new lane, but we have exactly the same problem. So this is just a simplistic cartoon to illustrate the kinds of things that happen if you don't think in bigger terms and much more systemically. So that's the approach I'm going to be talking about shortly. But before doing so, I want to switch to biology. I want to talk a little bit about biology, about life. and because it sets the stage and it sets the methodology and the paradigm for addressing some of the questions about cities. So here are some questions about life. Why? It's sort of amazing when you think about it. When you were very small, you ate and you grew. You grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And then at some stage, when you were probably about 17 or 18, you miraculously stopped growing. Yet you went on eating. So why is that? Why did you stop growing? Why did that happen? Why didn't you continue to grow like the way we think about economies and cities? Beijing began, I don't know how long ago, and has been growing, and it keeps growing, and it will keep growing. And that's true of almost all cities. So why is it that we stop growing? Why do we age, and why do we die? And in particular, why do we live 100 years and not 1,000 years? Or, as I put up here, 2 to 3 years like a mouse. And we're made of the same stuff as mice. Mice and us are pretty much indistinguishable in terms of our tissue. So where does this 100 years come from? Other questions? Oh, I showed this for those. So what happened here is the question. What has gone on here? Or why is it that we all are going to have to sleep 7 or 8 hours tonight? But you know, when you were very small, you used to sleep 15 or 16 hours. So why is it that you needed to sleep 15 or 16 hours when you were 1 or 2 years old, and now you need to only sleep 8 hours? Or, slightly differently, why is it that a mouse has to sleep 15 or 16 hours, but an elephant only 3 to 4 hours? So where does this all come from? And then moving it into socioeconomic systems, why is it that companies disappear? So when will it be that Google and Microsoft and Alibaba and Tencent completely are gone? When will that happen, and why? Whereas cities will persist. Cities will continue and persist. So for example, in other words, why is it that companies are so fragile? So major companies that have been around for a very long time, suddenly there's a fluctuation in the stock market or some external conditions change and they disappear very easily, but you can drop atom bombs on cities and 25, 30 years later, they're flourishing. So what is the fundamental difference? And I don't know what else I've got here. No. So where did these companies go? And the other one I want to talk about a little bit is why is it that life gets faster? Life has sped up tremendously, and I will talk about that a little bit later. So let me talk briefly about animals. This is us. We're one of these. These are mammals. We're one of these. And you know, they look quite different. They're different sizes. They look different. They live in different environments. They have evolved with their own unique history. Each one of these has its own unique evolutionary history. Each organ, each cell type, each genome inside each one of these has its own unique history. And so, what you would have thought is that if you plotted a characteristic, any measurable characteristic of these organisms versus their size, the points on the graph would lie sort of randomly all over the graph, reflecting what we think of as the arbitrary and capricious random nature of the process of random selection. So that would be the naive view, but in actual fact, it's quite the opposite. And here, what I'm plotting here is the metabolic rate of various animals. And metabolic rate, for these purposes, roughly speaking, means the amount of food you need to eat each day to stay alive. The 2,000 calories food calories a day you need to stay alive. And it's plotted here versus the body mass, the weight. And it's plotted logarithmically, so going up by factors of 10. And what you see is somehow remarkable, that underneath the extraordinary complexity and diversity and naively thought of arbitrary and random nature by which these organisms have arisen, lies an amazing simplicity. Some extraordinary simplicity has evolved from this. And the question is, where does this come from? And that's what we're going to discuss in a moment. So the other thing that's amazing about this is that the slope of this line is a very simple number. It's very closely approximated by 3/4. This number is about 3/4. And that has also a very powerful consequence, because if you forget about what I said about natural selection and so on, and you just thought of each one of these organisms as made up of cells, and you asked yourself, okay, I have an organism of a given size and I double that size, or I look at an organism that's twice the size of another one, then you would have naively expected that it would require twice as much food. There's twice as many cells, you would expect twice as much energy is needed. That's not the case. The 3/4 means, roughly speaking, every time I double the size, instead of needing twice as much, I only need 3/4 as much. I only need 75% as much. Every time I double, I save 25%. So there is built into this, what was written here, a systematic, regular, extraordinary economy of scale. Which also means that the bigger you are, the less energy is being used to support a unit gram, or a unit gram of tissue, or a cell. So the bigger you are, the less energy is required to support a cell, so that your cells are working much harder than a horse's cell, but it's working less hard than a dog, in a systematic, predictable, calculable way given by this graph. So that's what I've written here. But what is also amazing, first, well, two things. One is, I just showed you a certain subset of animals, but it's true across all of life, all organisms. This scaling law is true. And furthermore, if you look at any physiological variable, and I'll show you a couple, or any life history event, you have the same kind of scaling. So here's something that's very mundane, which is heart rate. And you see again, something very simple. The heart rate is decreasing in a regular fashion, and the slope of this line is 1/4, minus 1/4. Minus just means it's decreasing, but the slope of that line is 1/4. Here's your brain. This is what you think of as you. This is the white matter versus the gray matter, the processing part versus the cabling, so to speak. And what you see again is extraordinary regularity. And again, very great simplicity in something that is maybe one of the most complex phenomena in the universe, namely the functioning of our brains. And the slope of this line is very close to the number 5/4. And here there's much more variance, but this is the genome length of various bacteria versus their size. And there's, as I say, there's more fluctuations, but the slope of this line is again 1/4. And I don't know if I have one more I'm going to show you. I could show you 50 of these. Here is something very simple, is the radius of your aorta. This is the first tube that comes out of your heart, first artery that comes out of your heart. And that has a slope that is 3/8, which is written here, which means the cross-sectional area is proportional to 3/4 again. And what is intriguing about it is that our aortas scale in the same way as tree trunks do. So I could show you lots and lots of these, but the crucial point that I want to emphasize is the extraordinary simplicity underlying the great complexity of life, and also the fact that it should have become apparent from what I said, that the slopes of these lines are all simple multiples of the number 1/4. The number 4 is the number that controls all of life around us and within us. The number 4. It's amazing. And so, I've got one last thing. No, I think, yes, I'll show you this one last thing. So this is the way mathematically one writes that. This is called a power law. And this is the power law. This is the same. This is a scaling law for lifespan. This is how long you live. And that scales a graph like the ones I just showed with a slope of 1 plus 1/4. But I showed you that heart rate decreases with a slope of minus 1/4. And if you multiply these two together, then this times this, the increase of this with the slope of 1/4 is exactly cancelled by the decrease of this of 1/4, so that lifespan times heart rate is the same whether you're a shrew, which sits on the palm of my hand, or a blue whale, which is much, much bigger than this building. So the number of and what is lifespan times heart rate? It's the number of heartbeats in a lifetime. So a shrew, which only lives 1 to 2 years, has the same number of heartbeats as a blue whale, which is 100 million times bigger and lives 150 years. So there's the data, and you can see that the heart rates remain the same from the smallest to the biggest. So these are amazing laws, and the question is, where do they come from? That's what I said a moment ago. And the question is, what is the explanation from them, for them? And the explanation is something that has to transcend their design and transcend the details of what kind of organism they are. And what you realize is, if you think about it a little bit, is that one thing all organisms share, despite the completely different designs that have evolved, whether you're an insect or a mammal or a plant, the thing that is common is that we are all network systems. We are all systems of networks. For example, we are, of course, our circulatory system and our respiratory system and our neural system and our renal system and so on. And the idea is that these scaling laws are all derivative of the universal generic mathematical and physical properties of the networks that control our lives. So there's just a sampling of some networks. Some of them are inside us, some are not. But these are the various kinds of networks that permeate all of life. And the idea is that despite the superficial differences, that since we're all it is the mathematics of those networks that propagates through and gives rise to the universal life, universal scaling laws, and indeed gives rise to a universality of the pace of life in general, that all of these things, which are quite different, all are interrelated through these scaling laws: metabolism, growth, longevity, how quickly or slowly do you evolve, turnover times of things, diffusion, all of these various things which are quite different, all are interconnected and all obey the same scaling laws because they're all controlled by the same kind of network, geometry, and mathematics. So one can use this to derive many things and answer the kinds of questions I had before about how long we live, how long you sleep, and many other things. But the only one I'm going to talk about here briefly is growth. since growth is something we're obsessed with and something that plays a big role in socioeconomic systems. And we all know how we grow, how we did grow. I mentioned it before. We ate, we metabolize that energy. That energy is sent through the networks to feed cells, and at the cellular level, that's what's written here, at the cellular level, it's partitioned between maintenance, which means it repairs cells that are damaged and replaces ones that have died, and then the adding of new cells. So you put, well, let me just go back a second. So you have to put this into mathematics. So we have a theory, the theory of metabolism, and we use that to write down the equation in this statement here in mathematics. And one can solve that equation, and in so doing, we derive things like this. So this is the weight, this is an example of us, a rat, versus age. And the solid line is the prediction of the theory, which I just described. And those are data points. And you can see it's got a beautiful fit. And the thing that it explains, of course, is why it is we grow quickly and we end up stopping growing. And it turns out what I've written here is that you can trace back the stopping of growth, the cessation of growth, to this sublinear scaling, the economy of scale. That 3/4, sublinear meaning less than 1, the economy of scale that is inherent in the scaling of metabolic rate, which is derived from the networks. So we can understand this, this curve, but even more so, what is fantastic about it is that this is a universal theory with universal parameters, and it's true for all organisms. And the theory tells you that instead of plotting the data this way, the simplistic way of weight versus age, it tells you that there's a much better lens to look at it, a kind of rescaled lens. Oh, I'm sorry, that was just showing, I should have showed you this. This is just different curves for different animals and fish and birds and so on. But if you rescale, so I'm not going to discuss in detail what these are here, what's plotted, but the theory tells you how to rescale the weight, the size, and rescale time so that everybody, all these different animals, in fact, all organisms appear to grow in the same way. So there's a kind of universal commonality of the way everything grows when looked at through the same lens. So, and you can see, I don't know if you can read these, but there's many different kinds of animals. There's fish and birds and so on. But this is just a small sampling. And in fact, you could take that further and add in insects, and you can even add in insect colonies, beehives and ant hills and so on. And you can even go further and include cancer, include tumors, because tumors are also, in a certain sense, an organism. They grow on us. And in fact, this work leads to some interesting insights into the nature of cancer and into potential therapies for dealing with cancer, which is not part of this talk. So here's the summary of this little section about biology. It's dominated by these highly regular, systematic, predictable, quantitative, nonlinear scaling laws with this 1/4 power, this number 4, that those scaling laws have built into them a systematic economy of scale. So I've written here, the bigger you are, the less you need per capita to stay alive. The pace of life systematically gets slower. I didn't emphasize this. The bigger you are, things slow down. The bigger you are, things take longer to do. You live longer, and so on. heart rates slow down and so forth, all in a predictable way. Growth is sigmoidal, which means it stops. Growth, you start quickly and then stops. And then you die. And the theory explains that. The network theory explains all of this in a quantitative, predictable fashion. So, what I'm now going to do is take this framework and ask, to what extent can we take it over to understand the life cycle of cities and the structure of cities and the structure of corporations or companies, and from that talk about whether any of this is sustainable and the idea of the future of the planet. So the first question is, are cities and companies scale versions of one another? So what I showed you in the last 5 to 10 minutes is the following, that even though the whale lives in the ocean and the elephant has a trunk and the giraffe has a long neck and we walk on 2 feet and a mouse scurries around and we live in completely different environments, we are actually, in terms of anything that you can measure, at the 80-90% level, scaled versions of each other. You are a scaled up rat or a scaled down whale. That's who we are. So in a predictable scaling way, following these scaling laws. So the question is, are cities scaled versions of one another? Now, I can't talk about Chinese cities because I don't know enough about them, so I'm going to have to use American cities as an example. So the question is New York a scaled up Los Angeles, which is a scaled up Chicago? So the question is, are they scaled versions of one another, even though they look different, they have different histories, they have different geographies, and they have different cultures? So are they scaled versions of one another? Well, if we're thinking of this network paradigm, one reason you might think maybe it's possible is, of course, they are networked systems in terms of their physicality. We know that cities are transport networks and electrical networks and water networks and gas networks and so on. There's transportation network, and they're supplied by networks. But equally important, and I'm going to argue more importantly, is that they are social networks. That is, they are the interaction between people. I talked about that earlier, the exchange of information. And this is just a symbolic representation of social networks. Each node is a person, and those lines are connecting them to their friends. So there's a social network, but two very important qualities which are often forgotten when people draw, that's it. When draw pictures like that are forgotten, is that a crucial aspect of the networks is that they're modular, meaning that we form groups. That is that we have families, and we have groups, we have departments, and so on. We form these natural groupings, and they have a kind of systematic regularity. And secondly, what's important is that, you notice here, is that it doesn't matter how you communicate. You know, these days with the internet and cyberspace, we sort of forget that even though you can connect through the ionosphere, so to speak, when you're connecting with someone, you still have to be on a two-dimensional surface. You have to be in a place. You have to be in your kitchen. You have to be on a bus. You have to be in your office. You have to be somewhere. Secondly, you also have to be moving, because you have to go from your house to your work. You have to go from your house to the college. You have to go from house to school, from your home to the grocery store, from your home to the theater. You are always having to move and to have this modular structure. So if you put all that together and you take this network paradigm, it turns out, just as it did in biology, you could derive from that, the mathematics of that cities should scale in a similar way to biology mathematically, even though the nature of the scaling is different. And I will now elaborate on that, and I'm going to do it with the data. So first, from what I just said, this picture that I showed before, then, which was a kind of symbolic representation, is of course the manifestation of everything I've said. This is the sort of the manifestation, these streets of the physicality of the physical networks, and this is the manifestation of this interaction here, of the social interaction. So the other thing to recognize in this kind of picture is something that is important to also appreciate, and that is that what's going on here is what's going on here, and what's going on in university, and what's going on all over Beijing is people interacting, coming together, and most of the interactions and information that is exchanged, just as here, most of these conversations are sort of irrelevant and don't lead to anything. They're not, they're not important for other people and so on. But symbolically, what is going on here, that facilitating of the interaction leads every once in a while to the invention of a Google or a Microsoft or an Alibaba or the theory of relativity or quantum mechanics. So that's what this is doing, and that's what the network is doing. And as I say, if you put that into mathematics, you then, or that's another example of it, you then derive that there should be scaling laws, as in biology, and here's now some data, and this is something very mundane. This is the plot of the number of petrol stations, number of gasoline stations versus size. So this is gasoline stations versus size, and the size is just the population of a city. And what you see, and it's plotted again like we did in biology, it's plotted logarithmically, and what you see is very good evidence of scaling, and also that, like biology, it represents a economy of scale because it's sublinear. This would be linear. This would be, if I doubled the size of a city, I would need twice as many gasoline stations. No, if you double the size of a city, it turns out you only need 85% as many gas stations. So instead of the 25% in biology, it's only 15% in gas stations. So that's interesting. And here I've just shown 4 European countries. But it turns out, if you look at data from across the world, everywhere, including China, by the way, it's exactly the same. The same slope, the same about 0.85, the same 15% savings. So that's interesting. It's true across the world. But even more interesting, it's true for all infrastructure across the world. That is, this happens to be gasoline stations, but it's true for the length of all the roads, the length of the electrical lines, the gas lines, the water lines, whatever it is one can measure about the physical infrastructure, all have the same behavior, the same scaling, the same 15% saving. Every time you double the size of a city, you save 15% on the infrastructure. So that's interesting. But even more interesting is if you look at socioeconomic quantities, and what is plotted here are wages versus city size, and here is something that's called super creative. It's people like you, professional people, and so on, educated people, termed super creatives. And here you see there's a little more fluctuation in the data, but you again see very good evidence of scaling. But here we see something that you never see in biology, and that is, instead of sublinear scaling, we see something called superlinear scaling, which is that the exponent, which I've written here, the slope of this is bigger than 1 rather than less than 1. And it's bigger than 1 by about 15%. It's about 1.15, which means that the bigger you are, instead of having less per capita, which dominates biology and dominates infrastructure of cities, the bigger you are, the more per capita, the higher the wages are per capita, the more professional people there are per capita, the more ideas there are per capita. This is patents. This is a proxy for it. The more ideas there are, the more crime there is, the more police there are, the more taxes there are, the more construction there is, the more restaurants there are, and so on and so forth. I could show you another 20 or 30 of these from all places around the world, and they all look the same, and they all have the same slope. They're all the same. And here's just a panel of 6 of them, just to show you, of 6 different metrics from different places around the globe, and they all look pretty much the same. Put it into English, or here, to put it, what's coming here in Chinese, I hope, so I keep talking, I'll talk through this, is that if you double the size of a city, or if you look at a city that's twice the size of another one, then on the average, systematically, all of the good things that attract you to cities and all of the bad things that are socioeconomic, crime, AIDS, disease, and so forth, all of them increase systematically by about 15%. Anywhere across the world, doesn't matter, everywhere. And everywhere across the world where we have data. And so just to be clear, that means Europe, North America, all of Latin America, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, China, Japan, trying to think where else. Anywhere we could get data. What is missing is Africa and mostly India, just because we can't get data. So all of these increase by 15%, and at the same time, you save about 15% on all the infrastructure. So we're very good at suppressing the bad and the ugly. So this gives an understanding as why it is that cities keep growing, because many of the things that we consider good, like wages and culture and opportunities and so forth, all increase by about 15% every time you double the size of a city. And then we also have that, the battery's running out, I noticed. And at the same time, you save collectively 15% on all infrastructure. So the bigger the city, in this sense, from this viewpoint, the better. So marvelous that Beijing is growing. It's 20 million, let it be 40 million. You're going to save an enormous amount, and all of you are going to get many more good, wonderful things if you forget that you're also going to be susceptible to more disease and more crime. So, am I allowed to go on? So I already said that all of these can be derived from the social networks, and the idea is, it's kind of extraordinary that it's the same all the way across the world. It's almost as if that 200 years ago, that just before the Industrial Revolution began, all the countries of the world got together at some great convention and said, we're going to be building lots of cities in the 19th and 20th centuries. Let's define the rules by which we build our urban system, and let's all follow them. Well, obviously that didn't happen. It's remarkable that the cities in China follow the same rules as those in Portugal, but there wasn't any communication between the two. It's because they followed organically the evolutionary development coming from social networks. The fact that, and the reason they're the same is because the social networks and people are pretty much the same whether you're in China or Portugal. We all have the same kind of interactions and the same social structures. So, and the superlinear behavior, the fact that it's superlinear, comes from the following that makes it completely different than biology, and that is I talk to you, you talk to him, he talks to her, and she talks back to me, and we have this conversation, and we're discussing something, and we build on each other. I mean, that's the nature of discourse, and it could be something totally mundane, I don't know, like a football match, I don't know, or it could be something very profound. It could be some research problem we work on. Or it could be how we're going to deal with our mortgages, I mean, or whatever it is you have, and must have some analog to that. Anyway, how we're going to deal with our financial situation. But we build on things and we build up, and it is that positive feedback mechanism that is inherent in social interaction that gives rise in the mathematical structure of social networks that gives rise to this superlinear scaling. The bigger you are, the more you have per capita, and at the same time, it leads to the increasing pace of life. Again, quite opposite to biology, where it led to the decreasing pace of life. So I'm going to leave this out, I'm going to leave this out, and since it's late, I might leave this out. No, I'll say this. So here's another representation. This just happens to be US data. And what's plotted here, just to show you that the scaling, they all scale the same way, 4 very different things. You can't read it. Income, this is the average income. This is the GDP of the city, crime, and patents, all on the same. You can see they all scale in the same way. And underlying that is the idea of the theory is that these are all derived from social networks, social interaction. So science, of course, proceeds by not just making theories and models to explain, but then making predictions that you can test with data. So the prediction here is if I could measure the degree of social interaction as a function of city size, it should scale in exactly the same way. And until recently, that was extremely difficult. But beginning, when it was 10, 15 years ago, everybody in this room carries some version of this. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, the telephone company therefore knows pretty much everything about you, whether you like it or not. Because this is a detector of everything you do, and it's recorded by telephone companies. So in particular, it tells the telephone company knows who I'm talking to, where they are, how long I spoke to them, and where they're moving to, because it follows them on this. So that's all recorded. It's amazing, actually, whether you like it or not. It used to be that you could get that data from the telephone companies. And my colleagues at MIT got much of this. It's huge, huge amounts of data, enormous amounts of data. We got this data. Now you can no longer get it because the telephone companies began to realize that this data was worth money. Because they're rather stupid, they didn't realize that they were sitting on something that was actually quite important because it tells you about people. Then they learned from scientists who were doing research that actually it was quite important, so they no longer can we get that data. So we use that data to analyze the degree of connectivity as a function of city size. So, and the way you do it, by the way, is I call you, and then within 1 month or 6 months, you can determine, it's up to you to tell you the threshold, you call me back. That means we have a relationship. So we count those in the data and then plot them versus the size. So that's a simple way of saying what we did. And if you do that, this is what you get. Here it is here on the right, and you can see it's just like this. The two colors there, which I think you can see, are two different countries. One is the United Kingdom, and the other one is Portugal. And they're exactly the same, and you can see the slope is almost exactly the same as that, as predicted. I'm going to leave this out because we're getting late, and I'm going to leave this out. I'm sorry. Leave all this out. I said a few minutes ago that the network determines the pace of life. And in biology, where we had economies of scale, the slope less than 1, the pace of life slows down. Everything slows down the bigger you get. And at the same time, when you grow, you stop growing eventually. And the slowing of the pace of life and the stopping of growth have been crucial in the sustainability of life on this planet over 3 billion years. Those have been crucial elements. Socioeconomic interactions, as I've just said, give rise to superlinear behavior, that is a slope bigger than 1, and that implies that the pace of life speeds up in a predictable, systematic way. And here I just give you 2 examples. I showed you this before. This was heart rates. And it's got more spread in it. I showed you this just for fun. This is old data on the speed of walking in cities. And you can see the speed of walking systematically increases, and it follows the prediction of the theory. And I show you this. This is a photograph taken about 1.5 years ago, which I got from a British newspaper. And what it is you can't read it here. I'll read the caption. It says underneath, research revealed almost half the nation found the slow pace of high streets to be their biggest shopping bugbear. Bugbear meaning problem. That's why they didn't like shopping, because people were walking too slow. And so this is a picture of the first day in the city of Liverpool in northern England, where they put in a fast lane for walking so that people could actually walk faster, as fast as they need to walk in a big city. So there's an interesting example. So the last part of this, and then I'm going to finish off quickly, is to talk about growth. So it follows the same paradigm, the same pattern as we had in biology. We have something that I would call the social metabolic rate, which is you add all these things up, not just all the energy that's coming in, but now all the resources and products and the ideas have to be put into form. So this is extremely complicated, but this is what you could call the social metabolic rate. And that again gets allocated between maintenance, repair, and sustaining things and so on. So maintenance here means not just maintaining the roads and the buildings, but maintaining everybody here. You have to have doctors and hospitals and so on. That's part of this maintenance. And then new growth. And new growth means not just building new buildings and new roads and new infrastructure, but building new people. So having babies born and people moving in, migration and so on. So this is a very complicated equation, but amazingly, you can put this into mathematics and you can solve it. And I'm not going to go through that, obviously. But just to remind you, in biology, it gave rise to this stopping of growth, which of course is considered a very bad paradigm for socioeconomic growth since the Industrial Revolution. We now insist on open-ended growth. And indeed, one of the beautiful things about the theory is that the network theory, with this positive feedback gives rise to the superlinear scaling, and the superlinear scaling gives rise not to bounded growth, but to open-ended growth, which is what we see. So it's a very consistent theory, and it agrees. I won't show you data. It agrees very well with data on growth of cities and so forth. And that's wonderful, except it has built into it a terrible consequence. And that terrible consequence is indicated by this dotted line. And this dotted line is called a finite time singularity. And it's a mathematical term, mathematical concept. And what it says is what's sort of indicated here, that if you plot here any of these socioeconomic metrics, any of them, could be the GDP, could be the number of patents, could be the number of influenza cases, but if you plot those, then at some time, in some finite time in the future, could be 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, this will go to some infinite number, which is crazy. You can't have an infinite GDP or an infinite number of flu cases. Doesn't make any sense. And indeed, the theory tells you what happens. It says, as you approach this, the system stagnates and then collapses. So this would be terrible. And the question is, how do you avoid this? How do you avoid this? And how did we avoid it? And we avoided it by the following. We realized that in deriving this, we assume that somehow the conditions have not changed much. And that means that there might have been a major innovation taking place, like the discovery of iron back in 20,000 years ago. Or it could be the discovery of coal 200 years ago, or the invention of computers 50 years ago, or the invention of IT 10, 15 years ago, whatever. And so this has been derived in that paradigm. And so the idea is that the way you avoid it is you're coming up here, somewhere along here, you better make a shift. You better make a paradigm shift or make a major innovation which effectively resets the clock so that you start over again. You have to reinvent yourself so that you start over again, and that's what this is. So you start over again, and you take off, and of course you would hit, again, the same problem. You'd hit a singularity. So again, you have to make a paradigm shift, and so on. So it gives rise to this. So there's a theorem that if you want open-ended growth, then you have to have the sequence of innovations that reset the clock and you reinvent yourself, so to speak, and that's great. Except it also has a terrible consequence. I've said you speed up as you go along these curves. Life gets faster in a systematic, predictable way. It also implies that the time between innovations gets shorter and shorter. So something that took maybe 100 years to develop 1,000 years ago now would take only 20 years. And soon it will only have to take 15, and then 10, and 5. And so that you run into this problem that one has, if you take this to its logical conclusion, that one would have to have the equivalent to an IT revolution every 5 years, and then every 3 years, then every 6 months, which is obviously impossible and crazy. And indeed, this is not a sustainable system. So before going back to that, I want to show you this. This is not my work, but this is data, and I show it because it looks like mine. It looks like what I just showed you. But what is nice here is that these are inventions. You could think of them as innovations. And this is how long it took for each one of them to reach 10 million customers. So this is a proxy for the accelerating rate of innovation. And you can see the telephone took 40 years, but the internet only took 3 years. And the thing that's nice about this is if you take these numbers, they fit exactly the prediction of the theory I just described. And here's another way of looking at it. Here's what this is how long it took to develop, say, life, and this means just over 1 billion years to develop it, and it happened, if you go, you can't read it on here, unfortunately, because of this, and it happened 3 billion years ago. Until you go all the way here to the internet, well, the computer here, which took just a few years to develop, and it only happened a few years ago. And this line here is effectively the prediction of the theory. And I'm going to miss this out. We can do it again. I'm going to miss it. So I'm going to miss that. And the question is this sustainable? We're on this incredible treadmill that's getting faster and faster. And we're going to have to jump from one treadmill to another as we make innovations. And that treadmill is going faster, and we have to jump faster and faster. So I'm going to miss this out. And I'm going to do one last thing. Sorry about this. I'm going to miss this. I don't need this. I'm just going to say this. I will focus for a moment. This is actually to do with the diversity of cities. And what this is a histogram of the diversity of businesses in American cities. You could do that if we had the data. It'd be marvelous to do this for Chinese cities. And what you can see is that this is the most prevalent in New York, and the most prevalent in New York turns out to be physicians, and this is the next most prevalent, and so on. So this is New York, and then this bunch of things is Chicago, and so on. So you can do this for all 365 metropolitan areas in the United States. And what you discover, and there's just another few of them, just without showing the actual histogram. And it turns out those two, we can understand these and see that there's a universal distribution of diversity. But the important thing is that the most successful cities are the most diverse cities. New York, which is the greatest city in the world, is the most diverse city in the world. It has a diversity of jobs and opportunities. And that is one of the things that's made it great, is having the kind of culture and the kind of administrations that have fostered diversity and fostered people to try to invent new things and so forth. And frankly, I consider that a significant challenge for China as it moves into the future, because China has not been very good, at least from my own anecdotal perception, at fostering that kind of diversity. And I think it will need to if it's going to continue on this extraordinary rate of growth and remain sustainable with it. So that's incredibly important. More important, the reason I brought that up, and by the way, here you can calculate, in understanding the role of diversity, one derives that the GDP increases exponentially with diversity, meaning a small increase in diversity, meaning a new kind of employment, a new kind of job category is invented, increases the GDP exponentially. And in fact, the increase of one unit of diversity, one new sector, increases the GDP by about 0.5%, which is very large. So finally, in the last few minutes, I'm going to talk briefly about companies. This is data, this is condensed data from US publicly traded companies. And what you see is, and they've been put in bins, and what you see is, again, good evidence of scaling. But what is plotted here is income versus assets versus the size of the company. And the interesting thing about this is that unlike cities, companies scale sublinearly. The exponents here are less than 1, typically. And here, just to show you, this is all of those companies. This is companies, almost 30,000 US publicly traded companies since 1950. And you see there's great variance. And these dots are the averaging of bins of them. And to illustrate that underlying this, there seems to be some serious scaling. But if you look at these exponents, they're less than 1. And I did put this in because this is from our friend Jake, which is sort of amazing. What it is, this dark stuff in the background is the United States, from the United States companies. And this is Chinese companies, and which have only been operable for about 15 years in terms of the stock market. And you can see very quickly, Chinese companies are behaving just like once there was some semblance of a free market system, they react just like the American companies, which are over a much longer period of time. So that gives credence to the possibility that the dynamic at work underlying the scaling laws is universal. Now, if it's sublinear and it's like biology, then what that suggests, from what I told you earlier, you remember, in biology you have sublinear scaling. That leads to sigmoidal growth, meaning you grow quickly and then you stop and then you die. So this is that same set of companies, the 30,000 companies, and their growth curves. This is their growth, and you can see these companies going straight up are all those fantastic Silicon Valley companies making lots of money and zooming, and these are all the old companies that are flattened and going very slowly. And in fact, even more so if you renormalize these to the GDP. So if you take out the GDP, you see that all the big companies are just sitting on top of the GDP. So if in their sector there is a fluctuation of any kind, it's very easy for a company sitting up here that's so static to fade and collapse. And that's what happens. That typically happens. And these, which are zooming, will eventually be, if they survive, will be like this. But in any case, what it also suggests is, as I said, that all companies eventually disappear. Oh, I wanted to show you this. This is really unfair. But here's Walmart looking like a hockey stick, looking that zooming from its beginnings to mid-90s. And it looks like one of those hockey sticks and is going to go on forever. But this is if you put in data up to more recent times. And this is just the prediction from that growth curve. You just put in that growth curve, and you can see it's following this growth curve, which is turning over and going to stop here, and then Walmart will eventually disappear. And here's the data showing that. This is, again, the analysis of the mortality of companies. And just very quickly, here is the probability of death for these companies, and analyzing these. These different colors are just different sectors, different sizes of companies, and so on. But you can see they all bend over and they rise to a probability of 1 that they're going to die. And if you do the calculation, you find that the expected average lifespan of a US publicly traded company is about 10 years. So any company, so if you take a cohort of companies, half of them will have disappeared, even though they've been on the stock market, after 10 years. And it's rare that a company can last for 100 years. So I will finish there, but I'm going to just do 2 things to remind you of scale. One is, I didn't say this earlier, but you know, your metabolic rate sitting here, waiting me desperately to finish quickly, is about 100 watts, 90 watts. It's like an old incandescent light bulb. So you are amazingly efficient. So that 2,000 food calories a day, which may seem like a lot of food, is actually the equivalent to a light bulb, which says how incredibly inefficient we are in the things that we manufacture. And in fact, that is reflected in what I've called our socio-metabolic rate. So if you look at the socio-metabolic rate of someone living in the United States, which means adding up all the energy that is needed for that person, for me to live at the standard of living I live at in the United States, which means having an automobile, having an office, having all the roads, and having an iPhone, and having a television, etc., etc. If you add that up for each person, it averages out at about 11,000 watts, 100 times bigger than what we evolved with. Now, China, if you average over China, I don't remember what the number is. I think it's about 8,000, I don't remember. But probably for most of you living here in Beijing, it's probably close to 10,000. It's not much lower than the US for those that are. So going back to this graph that I started with, where you see this marvelous scaling, and here we are, man, woman, about 100 watts. And all in unison and in empathy with everything else. Every part of us is scaled properly and appropriately to ourselves and the way we interact with the complete biosphere, everything, all following the right scaling laws for every part of our physiology and every part of our life history. That's how we were until about 10,000 years ago, and especially until about 200 years ago. And from there, what has happened is we've gone up from here to way up there. That's the 11,000. And you can now ask, how big an animal is each person in this room, or at least each person in an equivalent American room? You won't be much smaller. And it's about 30,000 kilograms. That's what you're operating at, as if, or about a dozen elephants. So that's each one of us in the developed world and in the major cities of China, approximately this. And there are 7.5 billion people on the planet, all of whom would like to be like this. And in a very short period of time, there are at least 3 billion more coming on board. And each one would like to live like this. So that's the big issue we have to face. Finally, I have two quotes. One is from the great economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who made this remark that is often quoted. I think actually a version of this is attributed to Marx, but he never actually said it. He said words, but it's really Schumpeter that said it within economics. Creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. We need things to die for new things to evolve. But he said something much more profound, which I take very personal, I think very personal, and that we should all be conscious of. All successful people are standing on ground that is crumbling beneath their feet. Again, that you need change. And finally, my final thing is a quote from the great John von Neumann, the great mathematical physicist, without whom none of us would be having those iPhones or computers or any of the IT, all of the marvelous things that are dominating our lives, without von Neumann and his thing. And here's what he said: 60 years ago, the ever-accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of race, beyond which human affairs as we know them could not continue. It's amazing that he made such a statement, and that is, if we don't change something fundamental, that's what, if you take the work that I have just described and you take it to its logical conclusion, would imply. I'm not saying that's what will happen, but because maybe something will change, or human beings will change, Although, I must say, with the kinds of political leadership we have, it seems extremely unlikely, but it's not a necessary consequence, but unfortunately, the way we're moving, it's a very disturbing possibility. So on that, I will finish. I talked too long, and I appreciate you, first of all, waiting. I mean, I can't believe I'm amazed you aren't all walking out. First of all, you waited for an hour, and then you listened to me ramble on too long talking. So I appreciate your hospitality and generosity of listening, and thank you very much.